Hi, it's Alex here from Tales from the Green Benches, a History of Parliament podcast. In this mini episode, we'd like to introduce you to what goes on behind the scenes when you're creating a major oral history archive, tell you a little bit about the project and our personal stories from interviewing MPs. And with me is Emma, who's right here.
Yes, so the Oral History Archive is the History of Parliament's most contemporary research project. Most of my colleagues are busy burrowing away in the archives, researching Parliament from hundreds of years ago. So we were founded as an organisation to study Parliament through the lives of parliamentarians. And our website, historyofparliamentonline.org, you can find hundreds of biographies and other articles on Parliament going way back to the 14th century. But to do some more contemporary research, back in 2011, our then director, Paul Seward, wanted to start collecting materials for future historians and biographers. So he recruited our fantastic colleague, Priscilla Pivato, to set up and run an oral history project. And I think you were involved at the very first volunteer training session, Alex, weren't you, for the project?
Yes, that's where I first met you and Priscilla. Now, Priscilla's been on the project for many years, and although she's not speaking in the podcast, she knows this archive, inside and out. She knows it better than anyone else. And you and Priscilla published a book, in 2020, didn't you, called The Political Lives of Post-War British MPs, which, really explores that archive, doesn't it? And it's reasonably well priced and as a paperback even, isn't it?
Yes, thank you very much for that completely unexpected and unprompted plug for our book. Thank you, Alex, very much. Yes, so Priscilla has all set the project up with the support of the British Library's Sound Archive. So they were working with Rob Perks, Mary Stewart and everyone else over there over the years. And they've been really our absolute gurus for everything oral history. We're really completely reliant on them for everything legal and ethical. So we're really, really excited that our archive is collected there with all of their other fantastic collections. So if you want to hear any more of our interviews, that's really the place to go to.
So there are nearly 250 interviews in the archive, though not all of them are available in the British Library yet. So as we've suggested, a lot of the interviews are undertaken by a brilliant team of volunteers, which is how Emma and I initially got involved in the project. And the volunteers are from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of people. So we have some oral historians, we have some people who used to actually work in Parliament, we have a lot of academics and some PhD students, and generally, other people who are interested in politics or British history more widely.
Yeah, so we'd really like to take this opportunity to thank our really wonderful volunteers. I think over the years we've had nearly 60 people interviewed for us or helped us with paperwork or did various other things. So we honestly would not have an archive without these guys. So thank you very, very much. We also want to give a shout out in this little episode to Emmy Ledgerwood, who started, I think, with you back in the day, Alex, in that first training session, and now is in charge of running the whole project. So a shout out to Emmy as well. And that's really our whole team. So Alex, do you want to explain what we all send you out to do as a volunteer interviewer?
Yes, so once you've lined up a former MP for me to interview, which I suppose you do through the mail, through posting, I get in touch with them and arrange to meet, normally in their homes. It's best in their homes. Sometimes if it's in their offices, it can be a little bit formal as in terms of atmosphere. But we go to their house. They're often sort of very convivial, and we sit down and we record. And it's a real privilege to be able to just ask these people all sorts of questions and to be very, very nosy and record it all. It's great fun. But it's the History of Parliament that approaches the interviewees in the first place, isn't it? So how do you choose them?
Oh, this is a really difficult and it's changed quite a lot over the years because there are hundreds of former MPs and we are just quite a small team and we are reliant on volunteers. So the one rule we have is they are all former MPs and ideally they'll have left Parliament quite some time and not longer actively involved in politics before we interview them. Yeah, I think you know this, if you find people who are still in the Lords or they're still sort of actively involved in a political debate, quite often the interview can just talk about that current political debate and we're not getting the reflections back into what Parliament was like when they were there. So we try and leave a bit of space to have those deep reflections back on their career and how Parliament was and how it changed. So what this does mean is that our archive is very historical and that's what you'll hear reflected in these podcasts. We're talking about MPs in Parliament before 2010 pretty much, and I think we even have a few interviews now that are a bit later, but I think they go right back. So our first interviewee sat in 1952 was Denis Healey. I think the earliest person I interviewed was Janet Fuchs, who was in Parliament in the 70s. Alex, I think you go back even further in your interviews, don't you?
So, yeah, so I interviewed James Ramsden, who was the last Secretary of State for War, which I suppose
that dates him, doesn't it?
Shows how long ago back it was. And as these are life stories, we're interviewing, across a great span of time. So he recalled his involvement in D-Day, working, fighting during the Second World War, and he also later in Parliament recalled the Perfumer affair.
Oh.
And so, really, really interesting. But they go back quite some way, don't they, in terms of the date?
Mm-hmm. Really, the other thing we're trying to do when we're choosing who to interview is to get a wider range of MPs as possible. And so that's in terms of party and in place. So they're from all over the country. They're all different classes of people. A lot of my interviews have been from MPs who represented London or some in Wales, and now a lot in Derbyshire, which is where I've been living. So they come from all over the country. I think I've generally just interviewed Labour or Conservative MPs, so I think you've got a wider range of parties than me, Alex.
Yeah, so I've interviewed quite a good range, so obviously Conservative and Labour, but also a number of Liberal MPs, so people like Michael Meadowcroft and Eric Lubbock, who later was elevated to the Lords.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite interesting, the different parties, isn't it? I mean, it's always a tricky one trying to work out interviewing people who you don't agree with and how that stands. I don't know how you find that.
Yeah, it can be difficult interviewing MPs if you don't agree with them, but that's part of what the interviews are about, isn't it? It's about learning their experiences. We're not there to challenge them or to question them. We're there to understand their reminiscences and understand how they viewed their political career and understood politics in the period in which they were operating.
Yeah, I mean, we're really, really out to get a very diverse set of perspectives. And it's sort of interesting talking to people because you might not agree with their views on some things. I remember speaking to someone who I had completely different views on sort of gay rights and things like that. But we had very similar views on Brexit. So that was it sort of gives you a much wider perspective on these individuals as rather sort of just buttonholing them into they were this type of Conservative or they were this type of Labour person. And because they're so long, we get all those diverse perspectives. And I guess we're also getting that in terms of backgrounds, aren't we? Because we get into that a lot when episode 5, when we're talking about underrepresented MPs, as we're calling them. So we're trying very hard now to get a better, broader range of ethnic diversity in our archive. So we've got a PhD project starting next year, actually, to look at the experiences of ethnic minority MPs. And we were also recently interviewing or have interviewed MPs with disabilities. So Anne Begg, who I think was the first MP to be in Westminster in a wheelchair, and David Blunkett. So the one rule that we have is that they're really all former MPs. In an ideal world, they'd have left Parliament with some time, and ideally they'd no longer be actively involved in politics. But of course, we do have some members of the House of Lords who we interview, so that's a line we have to cross somewhere. But normally, by leaving them some time after they've left the House of Commons, they've got some more time to reflect on their time there, what's changed, really sort of deeper reflections back on their career, rather than lots of talk about current debates or current political issues. And what we do have is a really good range of class backgrounds, and relatively, compared to what Parliament was like, a lot of women. And these different perspectives really are just fascinating.
So the interviews themselves really are something very different. It's really quite a rich archive. The idea is that they are a life story, and we ask the MPs about their entire lives, not just their time at Westminster, so we understand where they're coming from, how their upbringing and background influenced their politics, influenced their decision to stand. We learn about the jobs that they were doing at the time that they came to Westminster, their frustrations in Parliament, their delights in Parliament, and also what happened to them once they left. Mm-hmm. It's a really rich resource for anyone studying, I suppose, social history as well as political history.
Oh, absolutely. And Alex is the person to talk to about this because he is by far our longest interviewer and goes for hours and hours and hours with different MPs. I think my longest ones are about 8 or 9 hours, which is nothing compared to what Alex gets up to.
Yes, I spent a very long and convivial time with Jonathan Aitken, who's obviously the Conservative MP, and Sylvia Heal, a Labour MP, who's also lovely. And as I said, I just love spending time with them, and it's a real privilege to be able to ask them so many questions and to understand their lives and their careers.
Yeah, no, and I think by having those long interviews that you have and going back over, because we quite often we don't do this in one day. We don't expect Alex to grill Jonathan Aitken for 24 hours on the trot. So I think the Jonathan Aitken one took you nearly a year, didn't it, to do? So we're going back and back and back. And I think that going back gives you the chance to really build a relationship with someone, and someone who can be quite an intimidating figure at start, or someone you might be a bit worried about meeting. But you go back again, you get a really good rapport going on. And I feel this when I go back the second time and I ask follow-up questions, that suddenly their sort of attitude changes, doesn't it?
Of course, yeah. Being able to go back enables us as interviewers a bit of time to reflect and to pick up on things. And also, we've already built that rapport. So often, the second, third, fourth interview is much warmer, and I think we get better results, don't we? Better answers to our questions.
You can almost see the politician, I think, sort of take you more seriously when you go back and you ask a follow-up question and they think, oh no, this person is here as a historical background. They're not a journalist asking for a quick quote. They're actually wanting to know a whole lot more. And I think that it's that change, isn't it? That's doing several interviews that makes it such a rich archive that we're creating.
You mentioned journalists there. So these people as former MPs are often media savvy. They're used to being recorded. How do we know that when we're recording them, we're getting the truth?
Oh, I don't know. And I'm going to get into a lot of trouble talking about the truth in oral history interviews because we're not talking about truth. I think we are talking about, what we're trying to do is collect people's memories. And as far as we can, we're really hoping that they're honest memories. And part of what we've been talking about in the length of time and that relationship and that rapport is what I think gets us the most honest reflections back from different politicians. But you're absolutely right in that we are interviewing politicians, aren't you? And that they are media trained. And we've got a recent interview actually that's quite funny because every time he does a slip, he wants to re-record the whole sentence in case he's going to get the soundbite just right. So I think there is that sort of media training aspect that we sort of have to break down, really, isn't there?
And in a way, I suppose all historical sources, and this archive is a historical source at the end of the day, needs to be used and understood in its context, like all sources. And of course, memory is a difficult thing, particularly for oral histories and people. How do people remember? Which itself is something to study and understand as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I think everyone. We don't perhaps think about this much, but your memories do change, don't they? I was thinking about this on the way here today. If you take about something like the pandemic, if you take the first lockdown, my memories of the first lockdown are now quite pleasant and quite cheerful. It was sunny, it was exciting, it was new. But at the time, I wrote some notes down and it was awful. Like it was scary but I don't remember it like that because the second lockdown was so miserable that my perspective on that whole thing changed completely. And I think that's what happens with your memory quite a lot, isn't it? With anyone's memory, that you live your life and you get on and you get different perspectives and you put those memories into different perspectives.
And one of the other difficulties we get with the oral history is sometimes people repeat memories, repeat stories, and partly because through the repetition they're used to telling those stories, aren't they? So we try as hard as we can to avoid the stories that have already been recounted in memoirs, or try to get under them somewhere, kind of get round them, trying to get deeper if we can.
Yeah, I don't know if you find this, but I think that those stories, they're sort of patter, they're sort of after dinner speech stories. They seem to come up in the first sort of half an hour of an interview. So it's like the first half an hour is them warming up and getting them all that out of their system. And then it's great, isn't it? Then you can go back and say, can you actually tell me more about that? Or why was that? And so on. And then you can bring out more for future historians to sort of listen to and get into.
And it requires quite a lot of skill in terms of the questions that you ask, asking open questions, trying to get them to answer in an expansive way, which is very difficult. And also I find something that's particularly difficult is when you're not entirely sure what you're going to get back or where it's going to go. You're always digging in a way in every question. And sometimes it leads to great results. Sometimes it doesn't work at all.
Yes, I was going to ask you then, Alex, about if you've had any disasters. We do have a few disasters in the archive.
Yeah, there's a few. Yeah, my most recent one was interviewing Lord Lamont, and I'd forgotten where he was born, and he told me, but at the time he was telling me, I was looking at the recorder to check it was all working, and mistook Lerwick for Lowestoft, which didn't go down very well in our first 10 minutes of meeting, really.
Yeah, well, you are doing 20 things at once, aren't you? When you're interviewing, you're checking the levels, you're sort of making sure the batteries don't run out in the recorder, you're trying to plan what your next question is, and you're listening very hard and making sure you're looking like you're listening without going all the time on the recording. So it's not surprising you get little slips. But of course, if you do that, it can be quite a difficult thing to get back from when you make a mistake. But you're doing all right with Norman Lamont. He's still talking to you.
He's still talking to me, yeah.
I know I definitely upset Janet Fuchs by keeping on asking her about being a woman in Parliament, and she got very, very fed up with me keeping on asking the same question, and it just wasn't something that bothered her particularly, so she didn't want to talk about it. And that's That was my first interview, so I think I learned quite a lot from that one. Our favourite one, or our famous one from the archive, is the interview, and I won't say the interviewer, but we have an interview with Tam Dalyell, who was this sort of legendary Commons backbencher who was in Parliament for nearly 40 years, I think. And he, when he first sat down with the interviewer, he just grabbed the questions sheet, and the whole first hour of the interview is him reading out the question and answering in sort of 2 sentences, and there's no back and forth or no rapport. It's just Tam Dalyell reading out the questions and answering them himself. But yeah, there's good stuff in there as well.
There's lots of rich stuff.
Yeah,
I mean, what I find funny is the background noises sometimes that you never can control sometimes. But there's one interview, isn't there, where the husband comes in to speak to one of the MPs and says, I'm going to go and cut the lawn. And she says, no, you can't, not on your tablets. Then a few minutes later, you hear the lawnmower going, don't you? I love that. Sort of the incidental sounds, which also tell a story.
Yeah, no, that was quite revealing, I think, about that particular MP and her response to that. And yeah, there's sort of quite a lot. I've had one where the wives are coming in and out and suddenly like inserting a lot of, oh, I remember that, or I did that. You can't really control all of these situations. We're not doing this in a studio. We're not practicing it and, getting it perfect. It's definitely of its time and of the moment, isn't it?
And what is really positive about this and about the interviews as a whole, is that we're starting to see the MPs as more human. It sort of humanises them. We start to see them and understand them as real people, with political backgrounds, with political careers, and with their own personalities and foibles. And often they're extremely charming and wonderful people, aren't they? Within contemporary political discourse is often criticised that, they're all in it for themselves, or what bloody MPs. But actually, this archive shows that there is a lot of crossbench support. There is a lot of supportive work environment within Parliament, and they are individuals that work with each other.
Yeah, no, I don't think any of the people I've interviewed have been anything other than charming. You can understand really why, even they've been put themselves up for election and people have chosen them and put them forward. I think you can see that sort of charm and that charisma come through quite a lot. And yeah, they are just much more human. We've got a great interview that our colleague Connie is doing at the moment with Jo Swinson, and her baby is bouncing on a knee, and there's this little gurgling every so often. I mean, so you see that you had them in the home environment, and you can hear it quite often on the take that they're real human beings, and sometimes they can get really quite emotional, these interviews, and very passionate. You can really get to why they fought so hard for a particular issue, or why there's something else that might seem completely crazy looking back on it, why it was such a big deal for them in their careers.
The breadth of questions we ask are enormous, aren't they? We begin, the first question is, what is your earliest memory? And we work all the way from there, right the way to what was your career after Parliament. One of the questions I find really interesting is, can you describe your family home? Mm-hmm. And that's always really interesting, particularly when they start describing it and you go down all sorts of avenues about their childhood and upbringing, which quite often informs their politics.
Or stuff about what newspapers were read in the house, what politics their parents had, things like that. You get a real insight, don't you, into their sort of family life. And I think we really get into this in episode 2, and it explains so much about why so many of them are politicians and why they had the politics they did.
And through the interviews, we also begin to understand Parliament better, don't we? We learn much more about the collaboration, the cross-party friendships, where they emerge from. The mechanisms also of Parliament, and what's the reasons behind them, the history of it, and Parliament's uses of it at that time, or MPs' uses of things like expenses, which we'll talk about and cover. Mm-hmm. So we learn a lot about how Parliament actually worked.
I think the cross-party friendships are great, isn't it? Your one with Jonathan Aitken, whose pair was Diane Abbott. I mean, that's a pair. We've got a recent one where a very, very right-wing Conservative MP said that his closest friend in Parliament was George Galloway, and you kind of think, how does that make any sense sort of politically? But you can see how being in Westminster and their relationships with each other really start to develop, and you get all sorts of strange relationships emerging from the interviews.
And we understand it through those relationships as a working environment, as a place of work. They're not just MPs voting fodder and soundbite fodder. They're trying to enact their own ambitions, enact their own politics, and by and large, almost universally try and do what they think is best for the country.
I think that really comes across. They can get quite emotional sometimes. They can be when you've spent 24 hours with someone, you can ask them quite a personal question. You can ask them something that perhaps isn't what you would be able to get if you would just had half an hour with them. I mean, we have brilliant interviews with people who feel like they're able to ask about choices on whether or not to have children, or people talking about miscarriages, or some very, very personal issues that you think, goodness, you wouldn't expect the MP to reveal that sort of information. And so it's a really wonderful social history to be able to have it. And part of the reason why, of course, that they are able, or feel that they're able to reveal so much and we're able to build up that trust, is that we give the former MP the option of closing part of the interview. So some of the recording might not be available for a certain number of years, which the former MP gets to decide themselves. It's on there, it's on the recording. At some point in the future, a future historian will be able to listen to it, but it isn't perhaps out at the moment where it might be politically sensitive or personally sensitive for that person to reveal that information.
So when do they open them?
I think it's entirely down to the discretion of the interviewee. So it might be something that they think is just a bit politically sensitive for the moment, so they might close it for 5 years. Or they might be thinking, well, I don't want this out when I'm alive and have to deal with the consequences of it. So the British Library ask us not to say after their death, because that's quite difficult for their record keeping, but they might say they want something closed for 30 years if it's something that they don't want to be released in their lifetime.
So I remember interviewing one MP that wanted his interview closed till the end of his career in case anything that he had said in the interview might be used against him.
Well, they're public people. You can see there is more sensitivity around what they're telling us, and they're doing us a great honour by trusting us to say these things and to reveal as much as they are. So it's brilliant that we get to have these interviews with them.
It is, because in the archive we get so much material that isn't recorded anywhere else, and that makes it so important. And that's something that we really want to show off in this series, that there's going to be a real behind the scenes view of Westminster. So we'll look at the whips, what it was like for people who arrived for the first time, how it impacted their family life, what the culture was like, how things actually worked for the people working in Parliament.
And if you want to know any more about our archive, then please do take a listen. Quite a lot of the interviews are available by the British Library online or in the archive itself, or there's a number of clips and other extracts on the History of Parliament website. Or of course you could take a look at mine and Priscilla's book, The Political Lives of Post-War British MPs. And we really hope that you find all of this as fascinating as we do.
So take a listen and enjoy.